Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Green. I am the managing editor of TheAtlantic.com, where I also write about religion, politics, and culture. And we have got a special panel here today, three people who are involved with the Supreme Court case Hollingsworth v. Perry, which overturned the Proposition 8 legislation in California, a ban on same-sex marriage. So over here, I have Stier and Kris Perry, who were the two named participants in that case. And then we also have Ted Olson, who is the former Solicitor General of the United States, who was also one of the lawyers who worked on this case, Hollingsworth v. Perry. So in order to talk about the future, we first need to go back in time a little bit. We're at Friday, June 28th, 2013. It's 2 days after the Supreme Court has ruled on California's same-sex marriage ban. Tell me what you're feeling, what's happening, what's going on in your relationship.
We're exhausted. Sandy and I had just been in Washington, D.C. 2 days earlier, celebrating Decision Day with Ted and the team. We went to Los Angeles for a rally, and we flew home the day before that. We got up that morning and went to work. I worked at home. Sandy went to her office, and we found out a few hours later that there might be something that day that we should know about, which is that the Ninth Circuit might lift their stay on the ruling. And if that were the case, our hope had always been that we would be married on the day that happened. And in order to get married that day, we needed to stop working and get ourselves near a courthouse. So that's what started.
Did you just carry a duffel with you with your clothes?
We had been for years carrying duffel bags around, but what was funny that day was that we ended up getting to the house roughly the same time, and we didn't even ask each other what we were putting in the duffel bags. But little did we know we'd be getting dressed at Gibson Dunn, the bathroom at Ted's law office.
Nice
and we ended up
bathroom,
picking out matching clothes. Completely random.
We have a bathroom there for people intending to get married.
It's a good public service. So, this court case, in certain ways, was historical. It was a landmark case overturning same-sex marriage, but it was also limited. It only applied to people who lived in California, and at this point, 2013, we were still 2 years out from the legalization of same-sex marriage in the United States. So how did that feel, that you all would be able to have this experience, that this momentous historical moment was happening for you, but so many other people in the United States still couldn't experience that?
I think for us, it was very bittersweet. We were so thrilled to be in California and represent our fellow Californians to get this incredibly important right, and it impacted people that we knew and loved in our lives. But we're also very aware of the difference in our country and how that right was not being applied equally to people across the country. And because of our involvement in the case and the people we got to associate with, we heard some very personal and painful stories of those individuals. And even all the way to the Supreme Court, the day that we went to the Supreme Court was the day that they, upheld the district court ruling and the circuit court ruling. That day, even though DOMA had been struck down in so many states, people still didn't have access to marriage. And so it's a victory, but it's not a full victory. And it didn't feel like a victory until just a few months ago, when in fact every single person in our country had access to that same right.
So this is great. Let's fast forward now to the summer of 2015. We have Obergefell, which is, of course, the Supreme Court case that strikes down gay marriage bans in the United States. So, for all of you, did this feel like it's over, we've won, this is the end, we've reached the final frontier? Did you have that kind of feeling when this ruling came down in 2015?
Yes, I did. And I know that everybody wants to sort of maybe didn't feel the way I did that day, but I was very teary and very moved by the completion of that part of this story. And the LGBT movement obviously has had many, many other battles, and there are still many more to have. But you have to acknowledge and celebrate the times when you prevail. And there was something very, very momentous about the 2013 ruling we were a part of, but the 2015 ruling that completed that story and let all the 13 remaining states achieve what we had in California. And I felt what I think so many of our friends felt in Massachusetts and New York and other places that had marriage equality before California, which is it somehow takes something away, some of your joy away as a married person, if you know that your friends and loved ones in other states can't have that. And I think our straight allies felt similarly bittersweet about their own marriages because they would see how much Sandy and I wanted to be married, or Jeff and Paul. And so this made that go away for now. And I think now we can focus on the next thing, which there's always a next thing.
So a footnote to that is that when we filed this lawsuit in May of 2009, only 3 states permitted marriage equality. So at the end of this case in 2015, all 50. And public opinions changed dramatically. That's only a period of few years. So it has been quite a journey.
So looking forward to some of those next challenges that you were talking about, Kris, Ted, I'm interested to know from your perspective, after this great legal victory that you won in 2013 and then watching it progress forward over the next several years, what have been some of the interesting legal challenges that have caught your eye for people who oppose same-sex marriage and are pushing for their own kinds of rights and protections?
There's all these cases that you're reading about a florist doesn't want to sell flowers to. Can you imagine if the florist would say, I don't want to sell flowers to people who are Jewish. I don't want to sell flowers because that makes me complicit in the wedding. Or people that don't want to issue, they're officials who don't want to issue a marriage certificate, even though that's their responsibility to do it. You're seeing those things disguised as religious freedom. And I think most of that stuff will go away over time. But you're seeing that play out in the courts of the country. Other little things about adoption, we've read about that just in the last few weeks. So there is resistance. I think the resistance is shrinking. The legal battles are there, will continue to be won by the LGBT community and their lawyers. And it's not going to completely go away. Every part of this country that tolerates discrimination against LGBT people, that's a remaining job left to be done. But it's getting done by courageous people all over the country.
So you brought up the cake bakers and the florists, and this is kind of an interesting irony of same-sex marriage, that after Obergefell in particular, the people who have come to kind of stand for these challenges, these exceptions, are people who do professional jobs that we don't often think about, so providing flowers for weddings and making cakes. But we've had a number of cases across the country where cake bakers, for example, will say, I don't want to serve at a wedding. Ted, do you think there's any legitimacy to this claim of exemption, not wanting to participate in the ceremony itself? And for the two of you, have you thought about that in terms of what that means for you personally and your relationship and your friends' relationships?
I'll answer part of it. I think that if you are engaged in commerce on the city streets of the marketplaces of this country, you can't say, I'm going to choose which Americans I will sell a cake to or flowers to. You don't have to participate in a wedding, of any wedding that you don't want to. So if you're a minister or something like that, that's your right to say, or my religion is this, thus and such. But when you engage in the marketplace, it's easy for me. It seems to me that if the civil rights laws protect you because of your race or your religion or your national origin, and you can't discriminate at a motel on a highway, then you can't discriminate anymore. In my judgment, it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause to discriminate against the basis of on the basis of an individual's sexual orientation. That seems to be easy. It's different to put personal services in a different category. We always do put personal services in a different category. So I think those are easily distinguishable. I'm pretty sure that's the way the cases are going to come out. And if you are a public official, you can't import your religious convictions into whether you will or won't perform a public duty that you have as a public official.
Do you all often think about your friends' relationships when you hear these kinds of claims come up about people who don't want to participate in these kinds of ceremonies? Does that personally resonate with you all, or do you think about it?
You know, I'm not as... I don't feel as intimately connected with those issues because they do feel random and they feel like they can't possibly really last and stand the test of time. But the thing that I really do connect with, and I think is actually a huge issue in our country, are laws like around adoption. When you have families who want to adopt children, these are big issues, and people in lives are impacted in an incredibly huge and long-lasting way. A child deserves to be adopted by a loving family. A loving family deserves to be able to adopt a child. And when that right is withheld from individuals, I think the impact is incredibly terrible, it's severe, and it's remarkably unfair. The cake and the wedding flowers are painful situations, but people's lives, children's lives, are, I think, the most compelling thing we have today to really worry about.
Yeah. So some of these issues are being resolved in legislatures, in Congress, but a lot of them are coming through the courts in the way that you all came through the courts. And one thing I'm curious about is whether you have advice for other couples who are in a situation, whether it be with a cake baker or whether it's with an adoption case, who are thinking about maybe getting involved in a lawsuit. What would you say to those couples?
Don't do it, right?
That's ominous. That was an ominous laugh. Yeah.
I think you should hire Ted Olson, obviously.
Very good.
Is he? Are you on
rehearsed a little
retainer or
bit.
something? Yeah.
I think if you believe that your rights have been violated in some way and you want to find out if you're protected under the 14th Amendment or you deserve due process or there's some constitutional protection, and we now know that individuals sometimes need protection from their states. And I really didn't understand that as well as I do today, that a majority of voters can pass a bill that violates the federal constitution, and as a member of that state, a resident of that state, I could pursue a remedy in federal court. And I think that many groups of people over many, many years have had to pursue that kind of remedy. And we're so fortunate to live in a country with a system, a judicial system, that is part of a checks and balance against the legislatures that don't always worry about the people. They worry about the majority. And we know that the majority isn't always, protecting the minority. And so it's a very, very important system that I've never been as proud of as an American as I am now as a plaintiff. And so I would say to somebody that hasn't pursued something like this, you should, if you believe that there's a remedy for you that would improve your life or the lives of people like you or children growing up in your state that don't have those protections today.
I want to go to questions in just a moment, so if any of you in the audience are thinking of things that you'd like to ask, have those questions in mind. But I do want to touch on something that you brought up, which is the unevenness of legislation across the country and the fact that states have so much control in this question of same-sex rights beyond marriage, which is what we're here to talk about. So maybe, Ted, you could speak to this briefly, which is the unevenness, especially when it comes to workplace discrimination laws and, on the other side of the issue, religious freedom and conscience protection laws, and how those differ across all of the different states.
Well, they're all over the place. And the same was true a few generations ago when the courts first began striking down statutes, federal or state statutes, that discriminated on the basis of gender. There was different rights under public insurance, Social Security, and on and on and on. So the courts started striking those down, but a lot of those laws were still in place. And it took courageous people to say, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, led the charge on those issues to eliminate case after case after case. It takes time. There are many laws in many states that permit discrimination in the workplace or in commerce or in connection with things like adoption or divorce or whatever. So those are still out there. With respect to religious freedom, I don't feel that that's too threatened. I do know that this stuff that's going on now, this terrible things that people are saying in the connection with the presidential election are pretty awful. But this country is pretty good about protecting religious freedom and religious expression. And a number of cases have gone to the Supreme Court in years, protecting people who have very unusual practices with respect to religion. And I think those are going to be taken care of.
Well, so now I'll turn it over to you. Does anybody in the audience have a question? This gentleman right here.
Actually, also a comment.
Okay. Keep it brief and mostly in question form.
Comment first, please. So the comment is that when anyone is addressing the rights across the 50 states, please be inclusive of the territories of the United States, including the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Puerto Rico. Thanks. The other point is I noticed in the programming of this particular summit that the B division has been sadly underrepresented. And I just want to say I'm one of the bisexuals who would really love to see someday the right for a bi person to marry a man and a woman. So I'm curious, having said that, what the likelihood of that, would be. Maybe Mr. Olson.
Well, I'll address it very briefly. It's not a simple subject. We have laws against polygamy, for example, that have been upheld by the United States Supreme Court. When you have a law that puts people in a separate category, that denies them privileges or rights that are available to other people, and if those rights are challenged under the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, the state has an obligation to justify that distinction. What are the reasons for it? With respect to polygamy and the history of the Supreme Court, the court has said, well, there are concerns about the rights of children in polygamous families. There is history of discrimination against women in polygamous societies. That's what the court said, that's not what I'm saying. So, in other words, it's a balancing by the court. Is there, and it came up in the context of our litigation, what was the justification for excluding gay and lesbian citizens from the right to marry the person that they love? And our opponents really couldn't come up with an answer. One of the dramatic moments in our trial was our opponent was asked by the judge, what harm can there be? In other words, what is the state's justification for denying Kris and Sandy the right to get married? Does it hurt heterosexual marriage? Does it damage any other institution? And the lawyer on the other side paused and thought about it and said, I don't know. So it was pretty significant that the lawyer, who was a very able lawyer, couldn't think of an answer to that question. So those kind of cases, and there's other types of cases that come up, those kind of issues will be put in tension, and a judge will have to decide.
And just on a personal, I think you can't know what someone's sexual orientation is by looking at them. So I think you might be presuming something that's not true about us or any plaintiffs in any case. I think what the judge did in California in the ruling, which I found really interesting and surprising, was that he talked about gender discrimination, which was in some ways the problem. I could have married one of the male plaintiffs in California, but I couldn't marry the woman I loved. That was not allowed. So what he pointed out was this was really a case of gender discrimination, which sort of opens up a different angle on this that, at least for me, I hadn't thought of in quite that way. So I think there obviously are a lot of laws that govern marriage, but I think you brought up another point, which is just maybe those assumptions about the people you're seeing in these cases aren't necessarily entirely accurate.
So sadly, we have to wrap up, but I think this is a great closing point that both of you made, which is that a lot of these challenges are still unyet resolved and may be interesting yet for us to keep watching. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Right?